There are three kinds of lies a person can tell. The kind you tell to save your own skin, the kind you tell to save someone else's, and the kind that starts as the first and turns, somewhere in the dark, into the second, without you ever deciding to let it. The girl who walked into King Taryn's hall that winter told all three before the snow melted off the courtyard stones. I know, because I was the man who opened the door for her. My name is Corvin. For 40 years I taught soldiers how to take a life and tried, with far less success, to teach one stubborn boy how to be a king. In all that time, I never once taught a soul how to love a lie until it became the truest thing standing in the room. But that is what I watched happen. So sit close and listen, because this is not a story about a crown. It is a story about a servant who was sent to deceive a king, and what broke loose in both of them on the day he finally saw her real face. The thing I remember first is the cold, and the way it made everyone honest. Cold does that. A man can hold a polite mask in a warm hall for hours, but stand him in a courtyard in the dead heart of winter, with the wind coming down off the grey-water passes like it has a grudge, and his true self leaks out through his chattering teeth. The proud men hunch. The kind men share their cloaks. The frightened ones go very still, the way a hare goes still, hopping the wind will mistake them for stone. The woman climbing down out of the carriage that morning went very, very still. I noticed it because noticing is the only skill I have left worth having. My sword arm is a memory now. My knees announce every storm a day before the clouds arrive, and I sleep maybe 3 hours a night, which is why I keep a ledger, a small leather book I've carried since I was a sergeant, where I write down the comings and goings of this castle in a cramped hand no one else can read. Who arrived? Who left? Who looked at whom for a heartbeat longer than was proper? It is the habit of a man who long ago decided that the truth of a court lives in its small movements, not its grand announcements. And the small movement I wrote down that morning was this: the princess does not know how to stand like a princess. She had the gown for it, Kalemore blue, the color of their banners, with a collar of stiffened silver lace that framed her throat like a snare. She had the carriage, lacquered black with the Kalemore swan on the door. She had the 4 outriders in their blue cloaks and the older woman fussing at her hem, and the herald already filling his lungs to bellow her titles across the yard. Everything a princess is supposed to arrive with, she had. What she did not have was the certainty. A highborn woman steps down from a carriage as though the ground has been waiting for her its whole life and is grateful she has finally come. This girl stepped down as though she expected the stones to refuse her. She kept one hand on the carriage door a beat too long. Her eyes went to the guards, to me, to the great iron-banded doors of the keep, counting, I realized later, counting exits. A princess does not count exits. A princess has never in her life needed one. I have stood in this courtyard for 30 winters and watched ambassadors lie to my face with the easy grace of men who lie for a living. I know the shape of a lie when it walks. And something about the woman in Kalemore blue had that shape, though I could not yet have told you why, or how, or what good it would do me to know. I should explain the marriage before I go further, because the marriage is the thing the whole world was holding its breath about. Veldenmark and Kalemore had spent the better part of 9 years killing each other over a stretch of river valley that neither kingdom could grow wheat in. It was the stupid sort of war, the kind that begins over a slight no one remembers and continues out of pure momentum, the way a stone keeps rolling downhill long after the hand that pushed it has forgotten the whole business. Both kingdoms bled. Veldenmark bled worse. We won the valley and lost a generation of young men doing it. And Taryn, who had been a boy of 19 when his father died on a frozen ford and made him king in the middle of a battle, buried so many friends that by the time the fighting guttered out, he had the eyes of a man 3 times his age. The peace, when it finally came with a price, the way peace always does. Kalemore would send its eldest daughter, Princess Isolde, to wed the king of Veldenmark, and the 2 crowns would be bound by blood so that the next generation could not so easily spill it. A marriage to stitch a wound. Princesses have been used as sutures for as long as there have been kingdoms to tear open. That was the arrangement. That was the woman supposedly stepping down into my courtyard. And here is the part that matters. The world believed a great many things about King Taran of Veldenmark, and almost none of them were true. They said he had killed his first betrothed in a rage. He had no first betrothed. The woman they meant was a cousin who died of the wasting fever while he held her hand. They said the scar that ran from his left brow to his jaw had been carved into him by a demon. It was a Kael'mor cavalry saber, taken at the ford where his father fell, and he had nearly died of it, and the surgeon who saved him still wept about it in his cups. They said he never smiled, that he had executed a steward for serving wine too warm, that he kept the bones of his enemies, that he was a monster wearing the shape of a young man. He was not a monster. I had known him since he was small enough to fall asleep against my shoulder during the long council meetings, drooling on a tunic I would have died defending. I knew what he was. He was a tired man of 18-20 who had been handed a kingdom soaked in blood and had spent every day since trying to wring it out. He was guarded the way a dog that has been beaten is guarded, not cruel, but braced, always braced, waiting for the next hand to come down. He had stopped expecting kindness from strangers somewhere around his 23rd year, and he had stopped, somewhere after that, from expecting it at all. But Kael'mor did not know that. Kael'mor knew the monster, and so it does not surprise me now, looking back across all the years between that morning and this one, that a frightened princess sitting in a black carriage somewhere on the Greywater Road might have heard those stories one too many times, might have lain awake the night before, listening to the wind, imagining the scarred demon she had been sold to, might have done something a braver and a stupider woman would never have thought of. But I am getting ahead. On that morning I knew none of it. On that morning I only knew that the woman in blue counted exits and held the carriage door too long and went still in the cold like a hare. The herald bellowed. Her Royal Highness, Isolde of the House Kael'mor, Princess of the Three Rivers, betrothed of His Majesty King Taran. And so on, the full freight of titles, while the woman they belonged to flinched at her own name as though it had been thrown at her rather than announced. I let her in. That was my duty, not the grand procession that would come later, with the court assembled and the king on his high seat. This was only the arrival, the unbarring of doors, the long cold walk from courtyard to the warmth of the receiving hall, where she would rest before the formal presentation. A small thing, but it put me beside her for the length of 200 paces, and 200 paces is a long time to walk beside someone you have decided to study. She walked the way I tell young recruits not to, looking at her own feet. I cleared my throat the way I do and said, "Mind the third step, Highness. It's worn smooth. Half the men in this castle have gone down on it at one time or another, and I've buried a few that way." Which was a lie, the burying part, but a courtyard lie, a thing said to put a person at ease. And she laughed. It was the smallest laugh, barely more than breath, but it was real. It came out of her before she could catch it, the way real laughter does, and then her hand went to her mouth and her eyes went wide, as if she had committed some crime by being amused. A high-born woman does not catch her own laugh like that. A high-born woman lets it go where it pleases. The world has never once punished her for it. This woman caught hers the way a servant catches a dropped plate, all reflex and terror, knowing exactly what it costs to break a thing in front of those above you. I wrote that down later too. She laughs like someone who is not allowed to. We came to the receiving hall and I left her there with the fire and the older woman fussing and a girl bringing warmed wine. I bowed. I went to find the king. Because it was nearly time, and because something was sitting wrong in my chest, and I did not yet have a name for it. I found Taran in the armory, which is where he always was when he was nervous, though he would have run me through for suggesting he was nervous about anything. He had his back to me. He was turning a whetstone over a blade that did not need sharpening, a habit from the war, the hands needing something to do while the mind went somewhere it did not want to go. The light from the high windows caught the scar on his face, and I watched him, For a moment, the way I had watched the woman in the courtyard, reading the small movements, he was sharpening too hard. The stone was nearly worn through. "She's arrived," I said. I heard the herald. The stone did not stop. All of the 3 rivers, apparently, are now my concern. "You'll have to put the sword down eventually, son. I am the only man alive who calls him that, and only when no one else can hear. Can't sign a marriage treaty with a whetstone in your hand." That earned me half a smile, the kind that did not reach the scar, that did not reach much of anything. "Can't I? Might be more honest than ink." He set the blade down at last and turned, and I saw what I always saw in him in those years. A young man wearing a king's weariness like a coat 3 sizes too large, hopping no one would notice it didn't fit. "What's she like, Corvin? You walked her in. You always know." And there it was. The moment I have turned over in my mind more times than any other from that whole strange winter. Because I could have told him. I could have said, "Something's wrong with this woman. She counts exits and catches her own laughter and stands like she's never given an order in her life." I could have set the whole thing tilting right then. I did not. I told myself it was because I had nothing solid. Because the impressions of an old man's gut are not the kind of thing you set in front of a king on the morning of his wedding negotiations. Because perhaps the girl was simply frightened, and who wouldn't be, sent across a kingdom to marry the monster of the Greywater. But the truth I only let myself look at much later, is that I said nothing because of the way she had laughed. Because there had been something so unguarded in it, so unexpectedly alive, in a courtyard full of frightened still people, that some part of me wanted to see what it would do. Some part of me, the part that had watched this boy grow into a braced and joyless king, wanted, God help me, to see what would happen if something alive walked into his life. So I lied to my king. The first of the many lies that winter, and the only one I told entirely to myself. "She's nervous," I said, "but there's spirit in her. I think you'll be surprised." He grunted, unconvinced, and reached for his good coat. The presentation was held in the great hall an hour past noon, when the thin winter sun had climbed high enough to come down through the eastern windows in long pale blades across the floor. I have seen 100 such gatherings. They are all the same. The court arranged by rank like crockery on a shelf, the courtiers murmuring behind their hands, the smell of beeswax and old stone, and too many people in heavy clothes. The king on the high seat, trying not to look like a man waiting to be judged. The doors opened, the herald did his bellowing, and she came in. They had dressed her properly now, the blue gown brushed clean, her dark hair bound up in the Kalemore fashion with a thin circlet of silver across her brow. From a distance, with the light behind her, she looked the part. The court certainly thought so. I heard the murmur swell and settle the way it does when a thing is found acceptable. But I was not at a distance. I stood at the king's right hand, where I have stood for 30 years, and I watched her cross that long floor toward the high seat, and I watched her do everything wrong in the smallest possible ways. She held the circlet's weight as though it were unfamiliar, and a princess's brow has worn silver since she was a child. She glanced at the assembled lords and then away too fast, the way a servant does not hold the eye of her betters. And when she reached the foot of the dais, she sank into a curtsy that was a fraction too deep. A princess of equal blood does not bend so low to a king she is to wed. She inclines, queen to king, an acknowledgment between equals. This woman went down like a subject. Like someone who had spent her whole life going down to those above her, and whose body simply did not know how to do anything else. No one else saw it. Why would they? They had been told a princess was coming, and so a princess had come. The mind is a great forger of what it expects. But Taran saw something. Not what I saw. He had not spent 30 years reading curtsies. He saw something else, something I did not have a name for until much later. He went very still on his high seat, and when she rose and lifted her face to him at last, the two of them looked at each other across the small distance of the dais, and the hall, for one breath, went silent. I have wondered since what passed between them in that silence. I do not think it was recognition. He had never seen her, false or true. I do not think it was desire, though the court whispered that later. I think it was something rarer and stranger. I think two people who had each spent years braced against the world looked at each other, and each saw, for just a moment, that the other was braced too. That the other was afraid. That the monster the world had promised them was, up close, only a frightened person trying very hard not to show it. Recognition of a kind, then, not of a face, of a wound. "Highness," said the king, and his voice came out lower than usual, gentler than I had heard it in years. "You've come a long way." And she, the maid in the princess's gown, though I did not yet know that was what she was, opened her mouth to give whatever careful, rehearsed answer she had been drilled in, some courtly nothing about honor and duty, and the joining of two great houses. What came out instead was, "It's much warmer here than they said it would be." A beat of horrified silence. It was not a princess's line. It was nothing she had been taught to say. It was the unguarded truth of a cold and frightened person who had been promised a land of ice and demons, and had found, instead, a fire and a tired young man with kind eyes and a terrible scar, and the relief of it had simply fallen out of her mouth before her fear could stop it. The court did not know what to make of it. I saw the older woman from the carriage go pale at the edge of the dais. But Taran laughed. It was a short, startled, rusty sound, the sound of a thing pulled out of long disuse. I had not heard the boy laugh since before the ford, since before his father died on the ice and made him a king at 19. The whole court turned to stare at it, this laugh, as though a statue had spoken. And the woman on the floor below him stared up too, astonished, and then, helplessly, the way she had in the courtyard, she laughed back, caught it too late, pressed her hand to her mouth. And the king of Veldenmark, who had not smiled with his whole face in 9 years, smiled with his whole face. I should have felt glad, some part of me did, but standing there at his right hand, I felt the cold of the courtyard come back into my chest, because I understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what I had done by saying nothing. I had let something alive walk into his life. I had wanted to see what it would do. What it was going to do, I realized, watching the two of them laugh at each other across a marriage that was built on a lie I had already half guessed. What it was going to do was break his heart, or hers, or both. There was no version of this that did not end in a face being seen that was not supposed to be seen. I took out my ledger that night and sat a long while with the pen dry in my hand before I wrote anything at all. And in the end, all I wrote was this: "He laughed today. God forgive me, I'm glad he laughed. God forgive me for what it's going to cost." I did not yet know the half of it. I did not know that the real princess was in the castle already, that very night, wearing a plain gray dress and carrying someone else's washing. I did not know that the woman the king had laughed with was named Senna, that she had been born in a fishing village that the war had burned, that she had served the house of Kaelmore since she was 9 years old, and had never in her life been looked at by anyone the way the king had just looked at her. I did not know that she had agreed to this deception out of fear, and was already, in the space of one laugh, beginning to wish with her whole heart that she had never agreed to it at all. All of that was still to come. That night I knew only the cold, and the ledger, and the dry pen, and the strange certainty of an old soldier who has seen enough battles to feel one gathering. Something was coming. I just did not yet know whose face it would break open. 3 weeks into the lie, I caught the real princess crying in a linen closet, and that was the morning I stopped pretending I did not understand what had been done in my castle. I had gone looking for clean bandaging, old habit. An old soldier always knows where the linen is kept, and I opened the door of the small storeroom off the east passage to find a serving girl folded into the corner between the shelves, her knees drawn up, weeping the silent, furious way of someone who has learned that weeping out loud only earns you more grief. Gray dress, chapped hands, a scullery cap pulled low. The kind of girl a man like me sees 50 times a day and never once looks at, because that is rather the point of being a servant, to be furniture that fetches things. But I look at people, It is the only thing I do well. And I knew her face. I had seen it 3 weeks before in a black lacquered carriage, framed in a collar of stiffened silver lace. I had walked it in from the cold. I had heard it laugh in the courtyard and then snatch the laugh back like a dropped plate. The girl crying in the linen closet was the woman I had presented to the court as Princess Isolde of Kalemore, which meant the woman the king was at that very moment walking the frostbitten gardens with, the woman he had laughed with and dined with and begun, God help us all, to soften toward. That woman was someone else entirely. I shut the door. I stood in the passage with my heart going like a young man's and the cold coming back into my chest the way it had that first morning, and I understood the whole shape of it at last. The swap, the fear that must have driven it, the terrible momentum it had built since. And then, because I am an old man and not a wise one, I opened the door again and stepped inside and shut it behind me. "Highness," I said quietly. She came up off the floor like a startled cat, scrubbing at her face, drawing herself up into a poor imitation of dignity. "I don't know what you went down too low," I said. "At the presentation, in the curtsy, a princess of equal blood inclined, she doesn't bow, you bowed like a subject, I noticed. I've spent 30 years noticing." I kept my voice gentle, the voice you use with a frightened recruit before his first wall storming. "I haven't told anyone. I'm not certain yet that I will, but I'd like to understand it before I decide. Will you tell me?" She looked at me for a long moment, the real Isolde, this girl in gray with red eyes and a princess's bones, and I watched the fight go out of her all at once, the way it does when a person has been holding a thing too long and finds, unexpectedly, somewhere to set it down. "They told me he killed his last bride," she whispered. "They told me he keeps the bones of his enemies in his bedchamber. They told me his face would turn the milk." Her hands were shaking. "I was 9 when the war started, Master Corvin. I have spent my whole life being told what Veldenmark would do to me if it ever got its hands on me. And then they wrapped me in a treaty and sent me here to put my hands in its mouth." She laughed, and it was nothing like the other laugh, the warm one in the courtyard. It was a small, cracked, terrible thing. "So I was a coward. Is that what you want me to say? I was a coward. The night before we arrived I begged Senna to go in my place, just for the first meeting, just so that if he was the monster they promised it would be her and not—" She stopped. Her face crumpled with shame. "I told myself I'd take her place once I knew it was safe. I told myself it was caution." "It wasn't caution. It was cowardice with good manners on." Senna, so that was her name, the maid in the princess's gown. "And now," I asked, "it's been 3 weeks, Highness. Why hasn't the lie ended?" And here she looked away, and her shame deepened into something more complicated. And she said the thing that turned the whole business from a foolish trick into a tragedy already loading its first arrow. "Because he's kind to her," she said. "Because she's happy. For the first time in either of our lives, one of us is, and it's her. And it's a lie. And if I walk out of this closet and tell the truth, I take it from her and I hand myself to a man I've finally understood isn't a monster but who will, very reasonably, never forgive either of us." She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I'm not crying because I'm trapped, Master Corvin. I'm crying because I don't know which thing I'm more afraid of anymore, being found out, or finding out what kind of person I am if I let it go on. I had come for bandaging. I left with the worst secret in the kingdom, and not one clean thought about what to do with it. Let me tell you about Senna, because by then I had begun, against every grain of my duty, to watch her the way a man watches whether he knows is going to change his crops. She was not beautiful in the way the court understands beauty. She had not been bred for it, sharpened for it, displayed for it. She was the other kind of beautiful, the kind that takes a little while to land and then never leaves you. A steady face, a wide and honest mouth, hands that knew work and could not hide it. The court had begun to remark in those weeks that the Kalemore princess was refreshingly plain-spoken, without affectation, unusually warm for a high-born woman. They thought it was charming. They did not know they were describing a fisherman's daughter who had never learned to perform highness because no one had ever required it of her. And who was there for, by sheer accident, exactly the thing the king had needed his whole life and never once received. A person who did not bend the truth to flatter him. The first time I understood how far it had gone was a small thing. It is always the small things with me. It was the matter of the steward's boy. There was a child in the kitchens, a scullion of maybe 10, who had been caught stealing a heel of bread, a twist of dried fruit, nothing, the sort of theft that a cold winter and an empty belly right into a child's hands without his ever quite deciding to. By the old laws he could have lost the hand. By the king's law, which was harsher in those years than I liked, he was to be whipped in the yard and turned out of the castle, which in that winter, for a boy with no family, was a slower way of losing more than a hand. The princess found out. I do not know how. Servants tell each other everything, and Senna had a way of being told things because she listened like one of them because she was one of them. And she went to the king. Not in the hall, not before the court. She went to him privately, which a princess is not supposed to do, and I happened to be at the door, which is where I usually happen to be. I did not hear all of it. I heard enough. I heard her say that she had stolen bread herself, once, when she was small in a hard winter, and that the man who caught her had given her his own dinner instead of the lash, and that she had remembered it her whole life and become, she thought, a better person for it than any whipping would have made her. I heard her say that a king who could spare a hungry child was worth more to his people than a king who could not, and that the people would know the difference, and would love him for it, and that love bought more loyalty in a hard country than fear ever did. I heard her say all this not as a princess pleading, but as a woman who had been the hungry child, who knew the cold of being turned out, and who could not stand by and watch it done to another. And I heard a long silence, and then I heard the king, my braced, joyless, beaten dog of a king, say, in a voice I had not heard from him since he was a boy, "No one has spoken to me like that in 9 years. I had begun to think no one ever would again." The boy kept his hand and his place. The king, that night, sat with me in the armory and did not sharpen anything at all. "She's not what I expected, Corvin," he said. "No," I agreed, the understatement of my long life. "I expected a treaty in a blue dress." He turned his wine cup slowly, not drinking. The scar caught the firelight. "I have been a treaty in a blue dress in my way, since I was 19, a thing 2 countries agreed upon. I had forgotten there was supposed to be a person inside the arrangement." He looked at me then, and there was something open in his face that frightened me more than any battle ever had, because I knew what it cost a man like him to open it, and I knew it was being opened over a lie. "I think I could be glad, Corvin, after all of it. I think I could actually be glad. Isn't that a foolish thing for a king to feel?" I should have told him then. I want you to understand that I knew it, sitting there. I want you to understand that I have not spent the years since pretending I did not have the chance. I had the chance every single day. I had it in the armory that night with the firelight on his open face. And I said, "It's not foolish, son. It's the least foolish thing I've heard you say in 9 years. Because I am an old man and not a wise one, and because his face was open, and because I had wanted, God forgive me, I had wanted from that very first morning to see what would happen if something alive walked into his life. And here it was, and it was making him glad, and I could not bring myself to be the hand that came down. Senna found me at the closet door once, weeks in. She had taken to walking the cold passages at night the way I do, neither of us sleeping, and we passed each other often enough in the dark that a kind of wordless companionship had grown up between the old guard and the false princess. She knew I knew. I had never said it. She had never asked. But she knew, and I knew she knew, and there was a strange honesty in our silence that was cleaner than most of the speech in that castle. That night she stopped. She stood with her back to the cold stone, the candle she carried throwing the shadow of her up the wall enormous and trembling, and she said, without looking at me, "I'm going to tell him." The candle flame bent in the draught from the passage. "When?" I asked. I did not pretend not to understand. I don't know, soon, before her voice caught. Before it becomes the kind of lie you can't come back from. There's a wedding being planned, Master Corvin. There are seamstresses measuring me for a gown I have no right to wear. There's a date. And every day I don't tell him, I'm not just lying about who I am anymore. I'm letting two kingdoms sign a peace over a woman who doesn't exist. If it comes out after the vows, she shook her head. It would unmake the treaty. The war could. She could not finish it. It might, I agreed, because it was true and she deserved the truth from at least one person in that place. It very well might unmake all of it. He buried his friends to win that peace, she said. Isolde told me. 3 weeks ago I thought he was a monster who'd earned every story they told about him, and now I know he's a man who bled his whole country white trying to stop the bleeding, and I'm the thing that could start it again. Me, a fisherman's daughter who was too frightened to say no to a frightened princess. She turned to me at last, and her eyes in the candlelight were terrible and clear. Do you know the worst of it? Tell me. The worst of it isn't the treaty. The worst of it is that I love him. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, the way that had undone the king. I didn't mean to. I was supposed to be a wall between Isolde and the monster. I was supposed to feel nothing. And instead I've fallen in love with a kind, tired, frightened man, and I have built that love, every good day of it, every laugh, every quiet hour, on a foundation that, the moment he sees it, will make him hate me. So I'm going to tell him, because love that costs the other person the truth isn't love. It's just theft you've decided to feel good about. I've heard generals give speeches before battles that moved fewer men than that frightened woman moved me in a cold passage at midnight. Then tell him, I said, and tell him soon. And Senna, it was the first time I had used her name aloud. She startled at it. When you do, tell him alone, not before the court. He's a king, but the part of him you've reached isn't the king. It's the boy who fell asleep on my shoulder during council meetings, the one the war never quite finished killing. Give that boy the truth in private, where he can be a person about it before he has to be a crown. It's the only mercy left in this for any of you. She nodded. She blew out her candle to save the wax, a servant's reflex she had never lost, and she walked away into the dark. She never got the chance to do it her way. The truth, as it so often does, did not wait to be handed over kindly. It came down like a wall. It came down 4 days later, at the betrothal feast. The Kael'mor delegation had grown. More lords had ridden in for the formal sealing of the betrothal, older men, men who had known Princess Isolde since her cradle, men who had bounced her on their knees and watched her grow. I had worried about them from the start. I had said as much to no one. A serving girl can fool a court of strangers for a season. She cannot fool a man who taught the real princess to ride. There was an old lord named Vazik, the late Queen of Kael'mor's own brother, the princess's great uncle. He had been too ill to travel with the first party and had come late, half frozen, leaning on 2 attendants, but with eyes, I saw at the moment he was helped into the hall, that had lost none of their sharpness. The kind of eyes that look like mine. The kind that notice. He watched the feast from his place of honor. He watched the princess laugh, and reach across the king to right a tipped cup with a servant's quick instinctive hand, and lean to murmur something to a kitchen boy that made the child grin. He watched her do, in short, all the small, honest things that had charmed a court of strangers. And I watched his old face change slowly, the way ice changes when the thaw comes into it. First a crack you could almost miss, then a widening, then the whole sheet giving way at once. He rose slowly, with great effort. The hall did not notice at first. Old men rise slowly. But he kept rising, hauling himself up on his attendant's arm, his eyes fixed across the long tables on the woman in the place of his great niece, and the hall began, table by table, to fall quiet around the strange sight of it. The king noticed. He set down his cup. "My Lord Vazik," he said, courteous, "are you unwell? Shall we?" "That is not Isolde." He said it into a hall gone silent enough to hear the fire. "That is not my brother's granddaughter." His old voice shook, but it carried. He had been a battlefield commander once, and the parade ground was still in him. "I bounced Isolde of Kael'mor on this knee before this scarred boy was weaned. I would know her in the dark, by her hands, by her voice. That woman is not the princess. I do not know who she is, but I will not sit at the betrothal of an impostor and call it peace. I have stood in the middle of cavalry charges. I have heard the world end in noise. I have never heard a silence as loud as the one that fell over that hall. I looked at the king. His face had gone perfectly, dangerously still, the stillness I had seen on him only in war, the stillness that came down over the boy and left only the king. I looked at Senna, who had risen halfway from her seat, one hand on the table, her face white as the linen, every good day of those 3 weeks visibly dying in her eyes at once. And I looked last to the shadows along the wall where the servants stood, and I found a girl in a gray dress with a scullion's cap pulled low, frozen with a wine jug in her hands, the real Isolde, watching her whole cowardly, merciful, terrible gamble come apart in front of 2 kingdoms. The king turned his still face to the woman beside him, the woman he had laughed with, the woman he had told me 4 nights past had made him think he could be glad. "Is it true?" he asked, quietly, so quietly, and that quiet was worse than any roar. "Look at me and tell me it isn't true." And Senna, God keep her, the bravest coward I ever knew, looked at him and could not lie, not to that face, not any more. She had wanted to tell him alone, in private, where the boy could be a person before the crown came down. She had wanted to give him that one mercy. The truth had taken even that from her. She opened her mouth. The whole hall leaned in to hear the breaking of it. And that is where I must leave you tonight, because what she said next did not end the lie the way any of us in that hall expected. Not the king, not the lords, not the real princess frozen by the wall with her wine jug, and least of all me, the old fool who had started the whole thing by saying nothing on a cold morning 3 weeks before. What she said next was the truest thing I ever heard a person say. And it changed everything. "Look at me and tell me it isn't true." I have carried those 7 words for the rest of my life. I will carry them into whatever comes after it. Senna stood at the king's side in a gown she had no right to wear, in a hall gone so quiet you could hear the tallow guttering in the great iron stands, and she looked at him. Not down at her hands, the way she had that first cold morning. Not away. The way a servant does. She looked straight into the scarred face of the king of Veldenmark, and she let him see her seeing him, and she said, "My name is Senna. I was born in Harnmouth, which your soldiers burned in the 4th year of the war, though I don't hold it against you. Your soldiers burned it running from mine, and the fire didn't ask whose it was. I have served the house of Kaelmore since I was 9. I am not a princess. I have never been a princess. Lord Vazik is right, and he is the only honest person who has spoken in this hall in 3 weeks, and that includes me." A sound went through the lords like wind through standing grain. The king did not move. "The princess was afraid of you," Senna went on, and her voice did not shake now, though her hands did, white-knuckled on the table's edge. "They told her you were a monster. They told all of us. And the night before we arrived she begged me to take her place for the first meeting, just the first, so that if the stories were true, it would be a servant who paid for them and not the daughter of Kaelmore. I agreed. I want to be clear about that, Your Majesty, because every voice in this hall is about to start making me into something I'm not, and I would rather you had the truth from me while I can still give it to you plainly. I agreed. No one forced me. I was frightened, but frightened isn't innocent. I chose it. And after, the king's voice was very low, after the first meeting, when you knew the stories were lies, why did the lie not end then? And here was the moment I had dreaded for 3 weeks, the moment the whole thing turned on. Senna did not protect herself. She could have. She could have said she'd been trapped, that the princess held her there, that the court would have killed her if she'd confessed. All of it would have earned her sympathy. All of it would have been a little bit true. She said, "Because I didn't want it to." The plainest, costliest sentence I ever heard. "Because for the first time in my life," she said, "someone looked at me and saw a person worth talking to instead of a pair of hands worth using. Because you laughed, and I'd made you laugh, and no one had ever told me I could make anyone laugh, let alone a king. Because every morning I woke up in that lie was the only morning of my life I'd ever woken up glad, and I was a coward about giving it up, the same way the princess was a coward about facing you. We are two cowards, your majesty, who between us nearly signed a peace in the name of a woman who doesn't exist. The difference is that her cowardice was fear. Mine, after the first day, was greed. I wanted to be loved, and I let two kingdoms hang over it, and there is no version of this where I am not ashamed. So no, don't make me a victim. I'm not one. I'm just a fisherman's daughter who was happy for 3 weeks and knew the whole time she was stealing it. She stepped back from the table. She reached up, and she took the thin silver circlet from her brow, the princess's circlet, the one she'd worn like a thing that did not belong to her, because it did not, and she set it down on the white linen between herself and the king. Gently, the way you set down something that was never yours. That belongs to her, she said. And she turned in that silent hall, and she found the girl in the gray dress against the wall with the wine jug in her frozen hands, and she said, "Isolde, it's done. I'm sorry. Come and be who you are." I want to tell you the king forgave her on the spot. I want to tell you he came down off his place and took her hands, and the hall wept, and the treaty was saved, and the two of them were wed in spring. That is not what happened. Truth is rarely so obliging, and Taran was a king before he was a man, no matter how much of the man Senna had reached. What happened was that the king sat in silence for a long, terrible moment with the circlet on the linen in front of him, and his face, the still war face, the one that had come down over the boy when Vazik stood slowly came apart. Not into rage. I had braced for rage, the whole hall had. Rage would have been easier. What came apart in his face was something worse, something I had seen in him only once before, at the ford, kneeling in the red snow beside his father's body. The face of a man discovering that the one good thing he had let himself believe in was gone, and that he had no one to blame for believing it but himself. "Get her out," he said. He did not look at Senna, he could not, I think. "Get them both out, the princess to the guest wing under guard, the other," his voice failed on it. He could not find a word for what she was to him now. "Out, I cannot look at her." They took her. She did not resist. She did not weep that, she saved for later, for the dark, the silent, furious way she'd wept in the closet that I'd caught the real princess weeping. She walked out of that hall with her head up and the whole court watching, a fisherman's daughter who had stood in front of a king and 2 kingdoms, and told the absolute truth at the cost of the only happiness she had ever known. And I tell you now, across all the years, that I have decorated men for less courage than she showed walking out that door. The hall emptied. The lords withdrew to mutter about the treaty, which was, as Senna had feared, now hanging by a thread. An alliance sealed over an impostor is no alliance at all, and the war hawks on both sides began that very night to sharpen the old grievances. I stayed, the king and I in the guttering tallow. "You knew," he said. He was not asking. "I suspected from the first morning," I said. "There is a point past which an old man stops lying, and I had reached mine. I was sure by the 3rd week. I caught the real princess crying in a closet, and I knew the whole shape of it, son, and I said nothing, and I will carry that to my grave, and you may put me out the gate for it tonight if you wish." He looked at me for a long time. "Why?" he said. 30 years, Corvin, why would you let me?" "Because I watched you stop laughing 9 years ago," I said, "and I have wanted every day since to see what would happen if something alive walked into your life. And then it did, and it was a lie, and I could not bring myself to be the hand that killed the only glad thing I'd seen in you since you were a boy. I felt very old saying it. It was selfish. It was the kind of mercy that is really just a man protecting his own heart. I'm sorry, not for wanting you to be glad. For the price, I let other people pay for it." He did not put me out the gate. He sat with his head in his hands for a while, and then he said in a small voice, the voice of the boy and not the king, "She set the circlet down so gently, Corvin, did you see? She didn't throw it, she didn't keep it. She set it down like it was never hers to break." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes the way Isolde had, the way the wounded do. "Who does that? Who tells the truth like that when a lie would have served her better? Someone who is exactly the person you thought she was, I said. You said she wasn't what you expected. You were right. You were just wrong about her name. It was Isolde who broke it open, the real princess, the coward who had started it all. She came to the king 3 days later of her own accord with no one's leave, and she made the guards announce her properly. Isolde of the House Kaelmore, Princess of the Three Rivers. The first time she had used her own name in this castle. She walked into the hall in a borrowed gown that fit her like the truth, and she sank. I was there. I watched into the curtsy of an equal, not the deep bow of a subject, the incline of a princess to a king. The thing Senna had never been able to fake, because you cannot fake the certainty that the ground has been waiting for you your whole life. Your Majesty, she said, I am the woman you were promised. I am also the coward who sent another to face you in my place. Both of those are true. I have come to give you back your treaty if you still want it on the terms it was made, my hand for the peace, my blood for your blood. The war ended in our children. I will not run again. I am done being a coward. She lifted her chin. But I have one condition, and I will not marry you without it, and you may break the treaty over it if your pride requires you to. Name it, said the king. There was something careful in him now, something listening. You will not punish Senna. Isolde's voice rang in the hall. She lied because I begged her to. Her only crime after that was being happier than a servant is ever permitted to be, and falling in love with a man who'd been told all his life he was unlovable. And then, when the whole world would have let her keep lying, telling you the truth anyway, knowing it would cost her everything. If you punish her, you are punishing the one honest person in this entire wretched business. And I will not bind my house to a king who would do that, peace or no peace, war or no war. She held his eyes. Choose. I watched my king. I watched him understand that this proud, frightened, honest woman in front of him was a good match, was in truth a fine one, brave where it counted, the kind of queen a hard country needs. I watched him understand that the sensible thing, the kingly thing, the thing every lord muttering in the corridors wanted, was to take her hand, seal the peace, and let the servant girl vanish back into the gray ranks of the forgotten where she had come from. The war ended. The kingdoms bound. The boy who'd buried his friends finally able to say he'd kept the peace they died for. It was the right choice. The whole weight of the crown was on its side. And I watched him not make it. No, said Taran. The hall went still again. Isolde blinked. I am grateful to you, the king said, and he meant it. I could hear that he meant it. You are brave and you are honest now when it costs you, and you would make this country a fine queen, and any sensible king would take your hand and your peace and count himself fortunate. I would be lying if I said the temptation wasn't there. I have buried a great many men for this peace, princess. I want it. God knows I want it. He stood. He came down off his place. The thing I had imagined and told you didn't happen on the night of the feast. It happened now, 3 days late, the way real things usually do, after the rage has burned out and left only what's underneath. But I will not marry a woman I respect while loving one I don't even have the right to name anymore. I've spent 9 years being a treaty in a blue dress. I won't make a marriage into one more, not even for the peace. Especially not for the peace, because a peace that starts with me lying about my own heart is just the next war wearing a wedding gown. I confess I stopped breathing. There will be another way to the peace, he said. There always is if men want it badly enough. We just prefer the lazy way, the way that uses up a woman instead of a year of hard talking. Veldenmark and Kaelmore will find that harder, longer road, and I will walk every mile of it myself if I have to. He looked at Isolde, and there was kindness in it, and respect, and no love at all, and both of them seemed relieved by that. Go home, princess. Be who you are. You'll make someone a fine queen, I only know it won't be me. And take my thanks for the bravest condition anyone has ever set me. You came here to give me back a treaty. You've given me back something I'd misplaced for 9 years. I don't even have a word for it. I do, said a voice from the door. Senna. She was in gray now. Of course she was. The borrowed gown had gone back to the seamstresses, and she had returned to what she'd always been, a servant in a plain dress with chapped hands. She stood in the doorway where the guards had brought her, for the king had sent for her. I learned later, that very morning before Isolde ever came. He had spent 3 days not looking at her, and discovered that not looking at her was its own kind of war he was losing daily. She stood there, the false princess in her true clothes, and she finished the king's sentence for him, the way she'd finished his loneliness 3 weeks before without either of them noticing it happening. The word, she said, is home. I will not tell you they lived happily. I have lived too long to promise anyone that, and Senna would haunt me for the lie. I will tell you the harder road got walked. The treaty was unmade and a different one made in its place over 2 more winters of hard talking, of envoys freezing on the Greywater Road, of small grudging concessions traded back and forth until the thing held a peace built slowly, by men who wanted it instead of quickly on the back of a woman who didn't. It cost more than the marriage would have. Taran meant it when he said he'd walk every mile, and he did, and it aged him and it held. Isolde went home and married a Kael'mor lord she actually loved, and wrote to Senna every year for the rest of her life. 2 cowards turned brave who'd built a friendship out of the wreckage of a shared lie. And Senna stayed. The court never quite forgave her, and never quite forgot her, and learned slowly to love her anyway, the way you come to love whether you can't change. There were no vows for a long time. A king cannot wed a fisherman's daughter the way he weds a princess, with treaties and trumpets, and the lords fought it, and the road to it was nearly as long and hard as the road to the peace. I am old. I do not know if I will live to see the end of that road. But I saw the beginning of it, and that is the thing I came here to tell you. I saw the king, on an ordinary gray morning some weeks after all the great speeches were done, in the cold courtyard where the whole story had started. I saw Senna come down the steps with a basket of washing on her hip, gone back to her work because she did not know how to be idle and would not be kept like an ornament. I saw her slip on the 3rd step, the worn one, the one I'd warned her about that first morning. Half the men in this castle have gone down on it. And I saw the king cross the whole courtyard at a dead run, scar and crown and all, the most powerful man in 2 kingdoms, to catch a serving girl before she hit the stones. He caught her. The washing went everywhere, and the 2 of them knelt there in the cold among the scattered linen, and she was laughing, that real laugh, the one she finally didn't catch, the one she let go where it pleased because the world had at last stopped punishing her for it. And he was laughing too, the rusty startled sound a little less rusty now, and I stood in the gallery shadows like I always do, and I took out my ledger. I have written down 40 years of small movements in this castle, the comings and the goings, who looked at whom for a heartbeat longer than was proper. That morning I wrote only 1 line, and then I closed the book, because some things you do not write down for fear of wearing them out. I wrote, he saw her true face at last. It was the face that had been there all along. And then I went down the worn 3rd step into the cold, to help them gather up the washing, because that is what an old man does at the end of a long story.